you so much. Wonderful. Okay, first of all, can we just give a round of applause to this outfit? Because Angela, you said this and I'm going to steal it. You are totally in your podcast era. Like it is just, you are killing it here. It is so great to be here.
Thank you.
I'm so excited to do this interview because I left journalism recently and I'm kind of exploring the podcast space. And I've already learned so much about you just through this book. It is such a how-to, which is wonderful for someone like me. First of all, what I love about this book is that it's such a pull back the curtain. Like you're like, this is how I did this. And then this is how I did this. And this is how I did this. And you don't usually get that from an author. So I thank you for your authenticity because I think that is just so key in connecting with an audience.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I tried. I put it all out there and I have actually had people comment saying, well, you're telling all the secrets.
Yeah, literally.
But I really do think that there's room for everyone to succeed. And so I don't feel there's anything to be held back.
Yeah, no, yeah. And we're those of us who are newbies are very thankful for that. One thing that I couldn't believe when I read this at the beginning is podcasting is 20 years old.
Yes.
That's nuts.
I know.
And I was clearly a late bloomer because Serial was my first podcast. Anyone else? Serial first podcast? Yeah. That was 2014. So it was around long before Serial. And you talk about actually Serial and all that stuff in your book as well. I guess I want to ask you, how has podcast impacted storytelling as we know it and media?
So I think podcasting, even before the year 2004, which is its original year on paper, audio storytelling obviously has so many roots way farther back. But if we look at what podcasts as we know them today, there's even evidence of podcasts starting in 2000 where Robin Williams was trying to describe this new thing he was doing. And he was saying, I'm in conversation with friends and it's audio files you could download. Anyway, so I feel like if we're looking at podcasting as we know it, so really looking at like around the year 2000 to where we've come today, I think it's been incredible for number one, breaking down the barriers of broadcasting. So right now it's hard to get on the radio, to get a show on the radio. And I use the example of niche shows like Hardcore History, which is for a lot of history fans that would never have made it on the radio, but that show is so successful and is able to, it's okay. It's going away. And it's able to bring together a niche audience, right? And it's 5 hours long, some episode, which you would have never got in 5 hours of radio. But so it's being able to lift these kinds of voices, niche stories where there are communities around it that really want to gather and rally, but it's democratizing it. It's breaking down the barriers, making it accessible. And I love that about the medium. And so we're seeing more and more of that. Now, of course, it can go to an extreme where it's unhealthy, but just like anything, right? And so it's about, having a critical ear and choosing what you want to listen to. And I think it's amazing how in an era where a lot of people have screen fatigue and we're in this hybrid remote work world where we actually have to be on our computers a lot, and with audio storytelling specifically, and I know there are video podcasts, but with the audio podcasts, which was my first love, I think it's really special that we can get down to our roots of like oral histories and storytelling, which is the backbone of humanity.
You did actually a TED Talk on this very topic,
yes,
right?
Yeah.
On audio storytelling, the importance of it. I started my career in radio and there's just this intimacy that's so different than being on TV. Can you explain why you think, I guess, podcasts have taken off? Is it because of that, you think?
Part of it, for sure. I talk about this in my TED Talk that when I was a radio reporter, I would go and sometimes when you were interviewing subjects, there would be a whole lineup of people wanting to interview the one person that was the person of the hour, the main story. And I would see the journalists with the TV stations with the cameras and the lights do the interview. And then I would go and I'd actually tuck my recorder right into my purse and I'd hold the mic. But I was just looking into that person's eye and having a heart to heart with them. And my clips were the better clips, all right? They were.
Because they weren't worried about how they look.
No,
right?
they forgot about it.
Yeah.
We were just talking human to human.
Right.
And that's what's so special. And I think even with some of the podcasts we create at Lead Podcasting, we definitely do video podcasts if it strategically makes sense. But we are able to get such rich stories and get people feeling so comfortable to share when you're able to take that off. And even when we're recording remotely, we turn the cameras off. and we just record audio. And I do think that that is one of the things that has propelled the medium, the authenticity, the intimacy. And then when you're listening when you're in your car where you would have maybe just been with one or two people and you're in a safe, private space. And like, even it has audiences engage in those kinds of environments. It's propelling that intimate connection. So I think it's really special in that sense.
What makes a good podcast? I mean, podcasts seem like they're easy to make. Are they easy to make, or is it really tough?
I mean, I think some people think it's really easy and it's probably harder than you think. And then some people think it's really hard, and I would say it's probably easier than you think. It's somewhere in the middle. And I do think that it's an accessible medium. And if you want to set up for success, there are just some foundational elements that you would need to think about that sometimes get missed. And I say that taking the time for those initial steps can really set you up for a successful podcast. And if you look at it that way, then yeah, it isn't too hard. You just got to know what those steps are. And so like an example is, a lot of times people have an idea and they have an exciting guest or two that they will know they want to interview on their podcast. But we haven't thought about who is the audience. We haven't thought beyond those two guests. We haven't thought about the format. Yeah, maybe you want to be in conversation, but maybe you want to insert other clips, or maybe you want to just talk yourself. I would say that if someone is wanting to try it, I would encourage them to try it. That's in the end of the day. That's
really
the whole point of the book. Yeah.
I literally saw you like half an hour ago or 20 minutes ago. I'm like, I have an idea for a podcast.
Yeah, we're already brainstorming.
We need to talk about this. But it's like people come up with these ideas. How do you get them to fruition? Like, what is I mean, I know you lay out the basically how to, but I bet you everybody in this idea has an idea of what would make a good podcast. So how do you get it to that level?
Yeah, they say the 80s, let's make a band. It's now let's make a podcast.
Let's make a podcast,
yeah. For sure. Which I love. When I encourage everyone to try, I don't believe there's any bad ideas, because sometimes there's an idea that would have been presented or shows that have been very successful that I was like, that was pitched to me, I would have said no. And It does success. It does have success. And that's what's amazing about the industry. You do not know what niche you're going to tap into and have it take off. And so that's why I don't think there's any bad ideas. I think it's worth just trying and putting out a couple episodes strategically and really responding to the audience. I think that's maybe another place where people go wrong, is like they have this idea, they're really married to it. They're like chugging along. And even though the data and the audience is saying differently, they're not willing to pivot. And so I'm a big believer in creating focus groups, getting feedback, and then looking at the data and pivoting so that you're able to really serve.
So it almost needs to be alive, right?
Yeah.
Like it can't just be your initial idea. It has to evolve and it has to be fluid almost. You know, you've been in this space for a long time. So what do you see as the way to kind of get an audience and then keep an audience, sustain that?
I think being really clear about your idea right from the jump is really important. And then being responsive in the keeping and helping to promote it. So I like to use the example of real examples. So I recently launched How to Fall Asleep Fast, which has been mentioned, with my husband, Boris, who's at the back videoing this. Hi. Thanks, Boris. But this is an example of a show that we did as an original with Lead Podcasting. And I like to do this because I want to really walk the walk. Even though we're doing it for clients, I want to do it for ourselves too. And so we had this idea of creating a podcast that would help people fall asleep. It's mainly music. I do a 1-minute meditation at the beginning. But Boris and I actually don't need any help falling asleep. We go right out. At the end of the day, we live hard. And so we weren't actually the target audience. And so we said, all right, let's make some stuff and then give it to people who actually have trouble falling asleep. And so we did, and we got feedback. We adjusted and we changed many things based on the feedback before we even launched. And so this was months of iterating and listening and trying new things. And so then once we launched, we continued to solicit feedback and have also made tweaks. So if you look at this channel, you'll see the first episode is actually 30 minutes. We got feedback that people need 1 hour at least. So our tracks jumped to being 1 hour long. Then we had people saying, you know what, we actually really love the meditation, but it's only 1 minute. Can you make a longer meditation? So we just put out a bonus episode last week that has a 10-minute meditation. So we're constantly trying to, and then we see where the audience responds. And so I think that's really important. And then on top of that, the promotional element and actually getting it out to people. So of course we shared it with our friends and our family, but also we've been submitting it for promotion within different podcast players, which is the number one way people learn about new podcasts. The research shows people learn about new podcasts within their podcast player. So getting a promotion within Apple, within Spotify, within Castbox can really be game changing for your podcast. So we've championed that. And then the second and third most ways that people find out about new podcasts is from other podcasts. So we're happy to be part of the Sonar Network. Shout out to the Sonar folks that are here in the crowd. Yay. Thank you. And, we've done some swaps with the Sonar Network. So I would go guest on their shows and talk about my show. And so hopefully we'd be able to have some audience bridging, or feed drops where I drop an episode on a complete other podcast feed. And then that podcast dropped an episode on our feed, and we're cross promoting, knowing that there's lots of audience to share and being able to help promote in these unique ways to continue the momentum.
You were saying in the book, there's, 5 million podcasts that come out every year?
Well, 5 million podcasts right now, apparently, though we don't really know that number is true, because it's like, video podcast count? There might be more, right? YouTube videos, like all of them.
But even if that's a minimum,
yeah.
I mean, it's very hard to differentiate yourself, right?
Yeah, definitely.
And how do you do that? Is it through these podcast networks?
I think there's many different ways to differentiate yourself. You could do it by really honing in on a niche for topic wise. Also, I love to say for Canadian audiences, Canadian listeners want to listen to Canadian podcasts. And right now, if you look at Canadian listenership, so Canadian listeners now, we've just surpassed that the average Canadian listener just over 50% listens to Canadian content. And that was just as of this year. And the research, so they want to listen to more. They just feel like there is not any options for what they want to listen to. So they're going to a lot of US podcasts.
Right.
And so what I say is even hone in on being uniquely Canadian. Even though that limits you in the global market, it also helps you cut through the noise. And then you're not just doing another interview podcast and up against celebrities. You could be really niche with a community or something that's uniquely Canadian that could then...
Or local, right?
Yeah, exactly. Like hyper local, which I think is traditionally where radio would go. But you could still be local with podcasts too.
I love that. That is so great. What about future trends? Like, what are you seeing as the next big thing in terms of podcasting?
So I'm very excited about, first off, the technological advancements. So AI is opening up many doors. The translation features that are available because of AI are incredible. And I'm pretty sure Lead Podcasting is the first company to sell a branded podcast that has an AI robot voice for a client podcast, which is really cool. Might be scary. Some people are not clapping. They're like, I don't like it. Yeah. I don't like it. But hear me out. So first off, we did a hybrid approach. We did a human host and it is a robot guest. And we just did it for the translated versions. Okay. So the English conversation happened. Then we had and then we translated to French and Spanish. And so in French, we have a French journalist from France who has redone the hosting, but then asynchronously paired with a robot translation of that guest voice who is speaking French, even though that guest didn't know how to speak French. So I think that's incredible for making podcasts more widely available globally.
Okay, that's wild. So you basically, I could record a podcast right now.
Yeah.
Then you could translate my voice into a different language.
Yeah.
And that podcast could go to Japan.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's wild.
So it's cool. It's really neat. It's going to become more global. This is right now. It's many steps. You have to take it. You have to put it into a different app. Like
wait, does it sound like my voice?
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, wow.
We are looking at doing how to
Why am I learning languages?
Yeah.
Like, I don't know. Duolingo.
We're going to do how to fall asleep fast in other languages. So stay tuned for that. It'll be very cool. Yeah.
That is wild.
So that element I think is really exciting. And that's one of the positive sides of AI. So there could be some incredible content coming out of India. They're a huge podcast, country, but we don't get to hear them because they're not all in English. And so we also will be able to engage with other and not be so insular with North American or English speaking podcasts, which I think is incredible. For listeners everywhere, including here. So the AI element is exciting to me. Of course, there are ethical and policy pieces that will have to be established and it'll be messy for the next little bit. But I feel like it will ultimately be for a greater good if we're willing to put in the work and get a little messy right now. So I find it empowering and exciting, and we're leaning into it carefully with Lead Podcasting.
Yeah, because there's obviously ethics involved too with AI, right? There's worries about that kind of stuff.
So everyone's signing off on a permission form. Everyone knows that we're putting it through this program. They know exactly what program we're using. We're not pretending, but eventually you're going to be able to just click a button within your hosting site and be like, make this available in French, and it'll just do it. Right now we're like taking the audio, uploading it to another place, re-downloading it, re-uploading it, right? It's a lot of steps.
Right.
It's going to be simple very soon, I'm sure.
Well, what podcast are you listening to right now? I'm so curious.
So I've been listening. So I love narrative series. I love Wondery shows. And so I've been right now. Okay. To be honest, I love narrative, like journalistic shows. I just found a chat show. I don't really love the chat shows, to be honest.
Oh,
even though we
really?
produce them a
Why?
lot. And it just doesn't speak to me as much as a narrative show does.
Interesting.
This is my personal preference. I respect them and I know they can do really well. But my 3 favorite thought leaders are Brene Brown, Simon Sinek, and Adam Grant. This is getting really nerdy. If you know any of those names. Yeah. And they all do a little rotation through each other's podcast where all 3 of them come together. If you're fans, I just followed their whole track of listening to them on all of each other's podcasts. It's so cute and nerdy. That's what I just recently listened to. So these are just if you don't know, these are thought leaders about, organizational behavior, human vulnerability, and understanding humanness. So this is like what they're studying, and just how to be a better person and how to be in this world and find happiness and joy and success and productivity. And so they're all based on research and like research backed, academic backed. And then they all have their own podcast and they all come together and they're all friends. I didn't know. And that just
makes it so much better.
It's so cute. I love it. Yeah.
Is there one genre of podcast that does better than the other? Like, is there?
No, I mean, there's so many different genres. Right. I guess, what do you mean by genre?
So like right now, for example, true crime is having a moment,
yeah.
Right? So is there a, oh wow, okay, look at that.
Of course.
Is there a kind of genre that you're seeing kind of growing? I mean, you mentioned kids podcasting is something that you're focusing on for your next book.
We'll talk about that. Yeah. So true crime is very popular. It will always be, I'm sure. Right. It's not for me, but I understand it's for a lot of people, and that's great. I think we have to be careful with re-victimizing people and honoring the stories. And sometimes it can be done in jest. And I think it's a little bit insensitive. But that's a very popular niche. If you actually look at the numbers, we're seeing that there's a lot of like comedy podcasts tend to be very popular.
Okay.
Sports podcasts, of course, have a niche community. News and current affairs podcasts, popular. But then it's like, what qualifies as news? So there is some gray around all of this. But as a whole, if you're looking at a niche audience, I'm very intrigued by kids podcasts. And obviously that is why, and if you've purchased a book or you're about to, you'll see I'm promoting a Let's Talk Podcasting for Kids, which will be coming out in the new year. So yay.
Yeah, you can count me down for that.
It'll be a new book. Yay. And
totally
podcasting for kids is it's going to be wild. Disney is investing in a lot of research. And I just think if Disney is investing, then there's something there. If you look at the year-over-year listenership growth for kids under 12, it's wild. Like the growth percentages is huge. And so I've got some cool ideas for kids podcasts. So we'll see where that takes me.
I'll tell you the reason. It's because whenever I put a podcast on, my kids don't fight in the car.
Yeah.
That's what it is. That's all it is. They just don't fight.
Yes.
They're listening
and that's good. And they're learning, hopefully,
they're learning,
right?
and they're not on screens. It's like the perfect thing.
Well, I'll say I did a workshop for tweens. So it was like 9 to 12 years old girls. And it was the first time, and I was asked to do a summer camp. And I was like, I played some kids podcast for them. And then I just played actually a fictional podcast, a sci-fi podcast that's made for adults called Case 63. I also profile it.
You have it in your book. Yeah.
It's a great show. I'm not even the biggest fan of sci-fi, and I loved this series. And I played the entire episode 1, 8 minutes. And this group of kids sat and listened in silence, 8 minutes long, like this. Some of them closing their eyes, listening. And it was incredible. Silence for 8 minutes. They were in the whole time. It ended. They were like, well, what happens next? That's episode 1. You got to listen at home. And it was really neat because Julianne Moore is the main voice on that show. And then I went around the room and was like, what color hair do you think the doctor in the podcast had? Blonde hair and a bun, brown hair with glasses. They all like guessed. And then I was like, oh, she's a redhead. And they were like, what? And everyone was, minds were blown. And that's the beauty of podcasting. Because you're creating this story
a movie for your mind.
It's like, creative. Yeah, you're tapping into these creative juices. You're building a scene. Everyone gets a very unique experience for themselves. We do this as adults too, but anyway, I just thought that was so special. And I was like, wow, if they're appreciating it like this, I have hope for the next generations.
Honestly, if it can be in silence, that's a win.
That's great, right?
Like, that's a win. That's amazing.
Yeah.
Wow, wonderful.
Yeah.
We can start with some questions. I have one at the end, but did you want to go ahead? Use it as a mic. Yeah.
I have a question for people who want to be guests on podcasts. They're eager, they have a topic, they really want to talk about it. And because it's so true that podcasting has become such a huge outlet, not just for the podcasters, but for people who want to discuss issues or whatever, and they want to be guests on as many as they can. What advice would you give to those people?
So it's the market in Canada versus the US is very different. In the US, you can actually pitch to these like middleman brokers that would help facilitate. But we don't really have that sort of infrastructure in Canada, and that's okay. It's probably coming, but there is a website called Podmatch that I like to recommend. So you could sign up either as a host, as a guest, or both. And then you create a profile, and then you could search through and actually get paired. It's not Canada based, but it still gives you access. And that's a neat thing that Canadians can still use. But really in Canada, it does come down to like, I think the best way to do it is individual pitches and very PR in its approach with tailoring it. And these are like, PR 101, which is like understand what that podcast is about. What do they want to talk about? What value add do you have for them? And making it really simple and clear. And then you're pitching yourself. And so, I think, and then establishing relationships in the podcast community that then you can go to in the future. And it's not just like a one and done, and really trying to embed yourself. So there's lots of Facebook groups. There's a Discord. And there's a lot of places within the Canadian podcasters Discord, for instance, there is an area where people can, connect to guests on each other's shows. So it's kind of getting into more niche communities, and having those one-on-one conversations.
Thank you.
Yeah. Go ahead.
I have a quick question. Thank you. As you know, I have a podcast. I'll pitch it, Coffee with Comfrey, for talent for young students.
Please pitch your podcast away. I love this. Yes.
Coffee with Comfrey.
Yeah.
Convery?
Comfrey.
That's his last name.
For students to actually discover themselves and figure out what success looks like on their own.
Cool.
For careers, as you know. When you get to that point, like where I'm at now, 200 episodes, 15-year-olds to 30-year-olds listening, how do you pitch it to a sponsor to get sponsorship? Right now, that's where I want to go next, so that I can get some, cool sponsors and some funding.
So yeah, the monetization piece is always an interesting one. So there's two different ways you can monetize. Some people choose to go through their hosting site, where you could actually do a revenue share with your hosting site, and they will just place the ads in there for you. Kind of like YouTube ads. You put markers in your podcast of where the ads could go. If you hit a certain number of listeners, they plop an ad in, and then you split the revenue. So that's one way that's pretty low lift, but then also, you are splitting the revenue, and it ends up being, a little bit, well, you have less control over it, versus if you were to go package it and go pound the pavement and try to get a sponsorship, which you can do. And I actually like that, because you're being able to build relationships. You could tailor the package based on what sponsor you're going to. Your show's called Coffee with Comfrey. Let's go to coffee shops and be like, this matches. And then think about what that connection could be and really position it that way. And then ink a deal that's really unique. That's not just based on impressions, or listens, because that can just be very two-dimensional. And I think it can be really valuable to be like, part of the package deals, I do a live podcast from this coffee shop, and I bring people on a day that you're usually slow, right? And you build a package that's really meaningful, and then you can just set up. This is a wild, wild west. You can just set a price, whatever you want for that, right? There's no framework, which is really neat. And, by engaging what their budget might be, and then building it into like a true partnership. Yeah.
That's a great question.
Legacy media, radio, television, newspapers are doing, honestly, a pretty terrible job in the podcast space. Is there two questions? One, is there anybody who's doing a good job in the podcast space? And secondly, what are some of the keys for legacy media to be better?
Very good question.
Yeah. So, okay. I have been at the intersection of radio and podcasting my entire career. I made my first podcast in 2010, and I started working in radio in 2011. So I've been really going, with both almost at the same time for many years, and overlapping. So I think when you look at, let's first talk about radio, and then we'll talk about print journalism. And I care for journalism and I care for traditional media. And I think it's really important for Canadians to have like ethically sourced fact checks news available to them. Right? Yeah. But unfortunately, the media landscape is very dire right now, and it's upsetting and scary. And I think from a radio perspective, I'm of course biased. My most recent radio stint with 640 Toronto, we launched a podcast, and that was the best radio podcast that I know of. It was called Today in TO, but it's the idea of it. And it's not that I made it. It's just that this was the strategy that seemed like a no-brainer. And if anybody else did it, I would be listening to that show too. And what we did was, instead of just taking the radio and uploading it online and calling it a podcast, which is what 99% of radio stations do, we took the best of the day, actually the best of the week. We pulled out these like key moments. And then we strung an original narrative, bringing it all together and being like, here's what you need to know. And then there was no original interviews. It was just the best of what we had already aired. So it was just thoughtfully put together and going, hey, here's what one politician said, and here's what the other politician said. And over the course of a week, here's what the other guy said. And now we're putting them all back to back. You make a decision. And like, that's so powerful and thoughtful and strategic. And like, that's the kind of news podcast that I think could have really changed the game. And
is it still around?
No. But unfortunately.
And is that because there's no money to support podcasts like that?
No, because that was done with an in-house team with no new hires.
Right.
Let's not get into that. But so that's that. But like that idea, anyone can take it. Please, another radio station, take it. Do it. Like we're trying to pave the way. And I think I haven't seen anything else like that. And every time I said that to anyone in the podcast industry or on the radio, like everyone was like, oh yeah, no brainer. Even this, I saw head sounding. Yeah, I'd listen to that. Yeah. Of course. And making it Toronto specific, because I said niche. Let's serve Toronto. A lot of these news podcasts try to serve Canada. Great. Let's serve Toronto. There's so many listeners here. And like, let's go niche and be really intentional. And so like that kind of strategic thinking is just not happening, unfortunately. And I tried myself to try to make it happen. And I did for a little bit. And I would just like hope someone else can carry that torch and continue for the sake of radio. And then with the newspapers, I feel like they've tried to leverage a lot of their own internal talent, which is great, but then sometimes missed a beat because they haven't had someone who has extensive background in podcasting to really give it that final touch or that final production value that listeners would expect. And sometimes they become so concerned. And again, I think it's like they get so concerned with championing themselves that they miss the bigger picture of just serving the audience. And so then they just interview their own reporters, no one outside. We talk to ourselves and we put walls up and we're us talking to us. And then that's not doing justice. It's an echo chamber.
Yeah,
even if it's a journalistic echo chamber, it's still an echo chamber. Yeah. Like broaden the horizons and speak to the best person to that topic, not just the person you assign to that story.
And the newsmaker of that week, right? Like
so
that's
the
reporter covering it, the actual newsmaker. Yeah.
New York Times is doing incredible work and they have their own app. And it's like, let's just look to them and see if we can even take a fraction of what they're doing and try it here. That's what I would.
I'm addicted to the Daily. I don't know who else is, but do you see that here? Like, it just seems like, I don't even know how we would lift something like that, or who would. I'd host it if anybody wants to pay.
So we do, yeah. But we have the Forefront from the CBC podcast. Yeah. We have the Decibel from Globe and Mail, and so that is, we have the big story from Frequency Network, and I'm happy that they're trying and doing the thing.
But it's not. But it's the numbers. The numbers aren't there.
Yeah. If you ask the listeners, I think people would Canadians are still listening to the Daily more than those shows, and so what is the disconnect, and how can we emulate that better?
Yeah, that's unfortunate. Go ahead. Yep.
Hi, I'm a professor at Seneca College. I teach in the Polytechnic. I teach in the journalism program. So, obviously we're always thinking about our students and what they're going to be, what the opportunities would be there for careers. And especially, with the contraction of the legacy media, that kind of entry-level positioning is just becoming harder and harder to find. I wonder if you could kind of talk a little bit about this entrepreneurial space of the podcast. And I can say to my students, go and make your podcast, but that I'm trying to learn and to gain industry knowledge. Are there opportunities in the kind of mom and pop shops that, when I first started in documentary, how much infrastructure is there, especially something like a longer narrative piece that needs research and it's like chase producing that, needs some of those more classic traditional media positions, but the need is still there. Do you do it all?
So I think there's definitely opportunity there, like for sure. And I think what's interesting with students, because I also teach at Seneca Polytechnic, and a lot of them don't start their own podcasts. Like they have all the tools and the ability. They might make one episode or they might do a part of class, but they don't actually take advantage that the medium is there. They have all the resources available to them. So few. Like every time I ask my class who has a podcast, one, maybe two, max, hands go up. It should be if you're serious, they're in an audio journalism class, like every single hand should go up. Why not? Try, learn. So I think there's a disconnect between some of their like motivation to take advantage of what's out there right now. And I don't know where that disconnect is rooted in. I've read a lot of research around Gen Z being an overwhelmed generation, and they are like scared of making a wrong decision, and so they're paralyzed. And I feel bad, and I try to support my students the best way I can to get them out of that. To say, look, how can we just get you trying something and not feeling like if you fail, it's the end of the world? Like it's okay. So I think there's a lot of like research that shows there's a lot of root causes to some of that disconnect. But when you talk about job opportunities, I mean, lead podcasting, I was teaching at Toronto Metropolitan University at the time. And I actually tried to hire one of my students. I said, I have a full-time job for you. I lead podcasting. And she turned it down. And she said, I'd rather be a gig worker. There was this uprise of the gig economy. And so I hired her as a contractor. And I ended up building my company to be more contractor and permanent part-time base because of the response. Like the best talent didn't want full-time, but now it's changed. Now people want full-time. Oh, I gotta redo the company structure. No. But like the company is the way it is now, right? But like it's interesting to see how like some of it is being dictated by them. But in short, yes, there's these opportunities, not only with companies like mine, but there's, tons of Canadian companies trying to hire for podcast roles. Canada Land, At Frequency Network, Pacific Content just got bought by a UK company. They're hiring and growing called Lower Street Media. Like there are some, and a lot of them are remote because remote recording has gotten so good. And so we have a Canadian working for a UK company right now. And that's amazing and easy to happen. And it's, so I just think the doors have really opened. And so, and just the same as a documentary, all those roles are relevant for podcasts, especially if it's going to be a more narrative style, documentary style podcast, which many of them are. So I think there's a lot of opportunity.
I love how you're ebbing and flowing and evolving, just like you're saying you would do with a podcast. Like your whole company, you're kind of,
gotta be agile.
Yeah, it's amazing. That's really commendable.
Thank you.
A lot of companies can't do that. In the back there. So I'm just going to repeat the question in case you didn't hear it. Top 3 influences in podcasting, and what's the best piece of advice from one of those influencers that got her to where she is today?
I honestly, there's no 3. I'm inspired and influenced by a million things around me, not only podcasts, but also like art and nature. And like, I am just so open and I find inspiration in so many places. And I love listening to all sorts of things. So yes, I have the podcast I like to listen to and I might nerd out, but I actually take time to listen to things that I normally would never listen to based on the way they're selling the podcast. But I go, someone recommended this to me, or this hit number 1 today. Let me listen and just see what's going on there. And even if I only listen to a couple minutes, I take something away. And it might just be something about what they're doing and how they're engaging with an audience, certain ways of using words, certain ways of using music. And I find it very interesting and inspiring to just that's why I listen to a lot of different things. And I think it's very, interesting to have all of these things kind of meld into each other because it is a cross-pollinated, like media, social media, podcasting, video, like it's all crisscrossing. So I think it's hard to put blinders up and go, I listen to these 3 shows. I really tried to take cues from everything, including social media and a lot of other platforms. So I would say, and some of the things I've learned could be as simple as an editing tactic, like, a really neat way of, here's one like stylistic thing that's just coming to my mind that I've heard and I've never tried, but it's nested back here of like, having the host, if you're doing a narrative podcast, having the host script end with a word that the guest clip starts with, and you actually overlap those words. And so you'd be like, and that's how the story begins with, and then like the person overlaps with begins and then starts their story. And like, that's a really cool editing trick that I was like, no, I've never tried that. I heard it done somewhere. Who knows now where? And I'm like, I'm going to file that away to try at some point when that makes sense for me. And so I like just kind of having these nuggets that bring inspiration to my work.
I was just looking at the time and how long I was given to do this. So we have 5 more minutes. I'll take one more question.
Firstly, super excited about your Habit Level Sleep podcast.
Yay.
You're here, so we love that, and I will let you know how my sleep.
Please tell me. Yes.
But the question, I think my question is, if you never touched on this briefly before, so I have a business, I'm an entrepreneur, right? So like, how do you know that podcasting might be a good option for you as a business owner? Like, because there's so many things you can do and we're overwhelmed as it is. So how do you know that podcasting is a good idea for your business?
Yeah. So how do you know podcasting is a good idea for a business? I mean, this is what these conversations I have every day with lead podcasting. And of course I love podcasting, but I'm not going to say it's everybody's perfect strategy that they should and tactic that they should deploy. It has to make sense for you in a larger capacity and a larger strategy. And so when you really are doing it from a business perspective, it's got to feed into something bigger. So one thing I like to say is, if someone listened to a podcast, what would be the next thing you want them to do? And I've had some people say to me, I don't know. And I'm like, okay, well then you could do it for fun and as a personal journal and great. But then like from a business strategy perspective, it doesn't make sense. You have to have a listener journey. So they listen and then there's a call to action. And then what is that call to action and how are we going to track that? And is that going to be meaningful for your business and for your growth? And that call to action could be many different things. Sometimes it can be just to sign up for a newsletter, to build a community. Sometimes it can be actually like a product or a service that you're selling and you're giving a promo code. And then sometimes there's strategy that has nothing to do with like, if you want to, that's the listener growth and you're like building an audience and building a listener track. But then there's also the like completely other side where you're like, the strategy is to create content. And I've had a leader say, listen, I'm about to launch a website. I don't want to write a million blogs, but I love talking. And so we talked for half a day and that became all of his website content. We transcribed it all. We chopped it up into 5, 6, 7 different episodes. It was a standalone series that, again, it wasn't about building that audience, but it was about building content for the website. And that was the strategy. And so now he had his voice infused with some great blog content, right? So like really thinking about where does it fit in and does that make sense? And do you have the time to do it? Because that's the other thing. People get ambitious. They want to start a podcast. They have time to record one episode and then and it goes nowhere, or they like pod fade. They have a couple episodes and then they dwindle and then
Pod fade. I like that.
Yeah. But that's why we help. Yeah, exactly. And we try to map it out from the beginning and say, hey, commit to like 10 episodes. And can you do this? Yep. That's a solid season 1. Let's go for it. And then we really build it out strategically so that it's aligning with the larger vision.
It's amazing. We're going to have to wrap up unless
you could come find me after for more questions. I'll be at the.
I have to just ask you because I need to take something right out of that book.
Okay.
You did a section on interviewing and you said at the end of interviews, you like to give the interview subject.
Yes.
Space. So I'm going to give you space. Is there anything else that you didn't talk about that you want to talk about?
Thank you. That's good. That's good.
I learned.
Sometimes you get really amazing answers in that. I just want to do a couple of thank yous. Thank you to you, Farah, for this thoughtful conversation and for reading my whole book. Thank you. Isn't she amazing? Thank you. I want to say thank you to Maggie John, who gave me such a thoughtful introduction. I was crying on the side. Oh my God. Thank you, Maggie. Check out her podcast. And I also want to thank Erica for writing the foreword of my book. It was so thoughtful and it resonated with me. And I have so much respect for what you're doing. And I've already voted for your show for the Canadian Podcast Awards. So I hope you win. Check out Happy to See Me. Thank you so much, Erica. Thank you. And one final shout out to Great Lakes Brewery, who helped make this event possible. And they have gift bags here for everyone. So before you leave, please grab a bag. And yes, you're getting a free beer. So Troy was here earlier. He had to leave, but big thanks to the Great Lakes team. They've been big supporters. And they have a podcast, Between Two Fermenters. Check that out. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you so much. And for those of you who want a signed copy of the book, you see them right over here. Feel free to start a line. I think we could probably do that maybe around here.
Yeah.
Yeah. And Amanda will be happy to speak with you as well.
Yeah.
Afterwards.
Thank you so much.
You guys have been such a great crowd.
Thank you.
Thank you.